This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Matthew Continetti, who serves as the director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. They discuss the historic 2024 presidential campaign and how the election might unfold in November.
Matt Continetti, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, we love having you on Reaganism, expert in Ronald Reagan and all things the conservative movement. Your book, The Right, of course, we discussed probably the last time you were on the show. And with the craziness in our national politics, we thought you'd be the ideal person to come here and organize all of this for us and help us think through it as we march towards our November presidential election. Of course, you're doing this at American Enterprise Institute, where you are the chair in American Prosperity. That's a Patrick and Charlene Neal chair in American Prosperity. And of course, that's what we're all hoping we're marching towards. And we'll see how this election impacts that. But have you in your lifetime, Matt, seen a crazier presidential election? And as you think about your look, particularly at 20th century American history and the conservative movement, have you seen a crazier period through that lens?
Well, the short answer is no, not in my lifetime. I'm 43 years old, so I kind of appeared on the scene along with Ronald Reagan's presidency. And, in retrospect, Reagan's presidency kind of ended a period of great instability and turbulence in American politics that began with the Kennedy assassination in 1963, went through the 1968 election, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of RFK, then, of course, Watergate, Jimmy Carter's chaotic presidency, the only unelected president, Gerald Ford, who was elected to neither the vice presidency nor the presidency. So Reagan's presidency, because it was a success, because he was such a historic figure, kind of put the lid on the boiling cauldron of American politics, really for about 30 years. But there has not been a presidential election like 2024 since, I think, 1968. And there are some similarities. We had the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in July of this month. And, of course, there were successful assassinations, unfortunately, that led to great social instability during that year. And then, of course, in March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent president, said he would not pursue nor accept the Democratic nomination. And 56 years later, we have Joe Biden saying that he would not accept the Democratic nomination after having pursued it. So in a way, Biden's decision to drop out of the presidential race with about 100 days left to go is even crazier than Lyndon Johnson's, which occurred at the beginning of the primary cycle, and there was a full primary. So the Democrats have now coalesced around a nominee, a presumptive nominee, Kamala Harris, who has won as many Democratic primaries as Donald Trump has. 0.
So you got right there a great framing, both historical and kind of where we are today. 2 out of the big 3 I wanted to discuss. Of course, the attempted assassination of President Trump and Biden dropping out, and the presumptive nomination of Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee. But there was also J.D. Vance, which from a historic standpoint perhaps is not as significant as the first 2. But as someone like yourself, Matt, who has a really deep and sophisticated and studied understanding of The Right, your last book, J.D. Vance is highly consequential as a selection. So let's start there, and then I'll work back into Harris, and then we'll also talk about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. But J.D. Vance, as the running mate, is a really big decision and high, consequential move for the future of the conservative movement in the Republican Party.
Sure. And a lot depends, of course, on how well Vance does in his new role, and whether the Trump-Vance ticket wins in November. But let's just start with some facts. J.D. Vance is the youngest vice presidential nominee since Richard Nixon in 1952. He has less experience, though, than Nixon did when Eisenhower chose Nixon to be his running mate in 1952. Because Nixon, of course, had started off in the House, being elected in 1946, and then moved up to the Senate. A few years later, he had already become a national figure over the Chambers Hiss controversies. So J.D. Vance is young. He's 40. He'll turn 40 years old a few days after we record this podcast. He's with very little experience. He just came to the Senate last year, 2023, having been elected in 2022. And he also is the first millennial to appear on a presidential ticket, which is kind of much to the chagrin of members of the Gen X or edge millennials like myself, who are kind of...
Oh, is that edge millennial? I was curious.
Because...
Yeah.
If you're born in 80, 81, you're kind of technically a millennial, but not really, because, we came of age in the 80s and 90s, just like the Gen Xers in a way, just a few years younger. So, edge millennial, that's how I identify, Roger.
I think that's a huge opt-out, because then you can kind of opt into whatever's convenient and then reject whatever you want to be associated with.
Look, I don't want to get us too far off track, but I think a great heuristic is, did you go to college before Facebook? And if you went to college before Facebook, you're not a true millennial. I think that the true millennials went to college when Facebook was a huge thing. In any case, that's Vance. That's Vance. He turns 40 this August, and so he is a millennial generation. What is the significance of the Trump pick? Because it's not a conventional pick. It was unsurprising in some ways. I mean, the conventional wisdom had kind of coalesced around J.D. Vance for some time. He had very strong advocates in the inner circle of Trump world, including Don Jr., pushing for him. But it doesn't really fit the normal frame of a vice presidential selection. It's not one to expand the coalition, right? To put new states into play. Ohio is a very red state. It's been Trumpified now since 2016. It's not really a bridge building exercise within the party, right? Sometimes, like when Ronald Reagan chose George H.W. Bush in 1980, he wanted to show that he could reach out to a different wing, the more kind of Ford-Nixon wing of the Republican Party with Bush. Well, if that had been the case here, the obvious choice would have been someone like Nikki Haley, right? I mean, to kind of build the bridges and heal wounds within the Republican Party. And it's not quite a double down, because even though J.D. Vance is MAGA, he's not quite like Trump. I mean, he doesn't have the business. I mean, he's a investment guy and has a startup and such, but he didn't quite have that CEO profile that Trump has, the strong business executive. He's a writer. He's a storyteller, someone whose life was turned into a movie. Mm-hmm. I think that appealed to Trump. But what is it about? I think what the J.D. Vance pick was about in the end was solidifying the America First brand on the Republican Party. Trump is constitutionally term limited. They're not going to change the Constitution. I hate to say it for the Trump fans, but he will have 4 more years in office if he wins in November. And that means 2028, if Trump wins, will be an open race. And so with J.D. Vance as the incumbent vice president, as we're seeing on the Democratic side this year, that would immediately push Vance into the front-runner position for the nomination. And that would extend the MAGA influence on the Republican Party for at least another 4 years.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matt. And the formulation that it solidified the brand is the most consequential and kind of best way to explain what is going on here. Because all the traditional ways you would make a vice presidential selection, he wouldn't come to the top. I am curious, though, how much that matters to President Trump, how much he thinks of it in those terms. And I guess on the one hand, J.D. Vance's story is very much something that I think President Trump would internalize and think it as a continuation of the brand, explaining Appalachia, the American worker, the class of Americans that the elites had forgotten. That all makes sense to me, and maybe that is the full extent of what you mean by solidifying the brand. But when you look at what J.D. Vance stands for, certainly J.D. Vance as Senator J.D. Vance, he is advancing a set of ideas that many of those in the MAGA movement push forward and talk about, but are not necessarily the sorts of policies that President Trump is kind of ideologically bound to. Tariffs, yes, but foreign policy, taxes, and I'm sure you could spout a dozen other examples, Matt, where J.D. Vance has decided views, has said this is what it means to be a MAGA Republican and where the populists want to go, but at the end of the day, are probably not the sort of thing that Donald J. Trump feels deeply beholden to.
I think that's largely right. I would say a few more things about what might have appealed to Trump. There is the extension of the brand. There's also the look. Trump really likes characters in politics who have a certain look. Trump liked the fact that Vance lost a lot of weight in the past few years. He's talked about how much he likes Vance's blue eyes. When Brian Kilmeade of Fox asked Trump about Vance's beard, Trump said, he looks like a young Abraham Lincoln, right? So the look, Trump is, of course, always visual. And so he liked the look of J.D. Vance.
And no mustache alone, right. And no glasses, right? So
no
those
glasses,
disqualifying
yes,
features, of course, are not a problem.
Yeah, as a bespectacled person.
Hey, you and me, my friend.
So there's that, the look. There's also loyalty, okay? And so I think that what was communicated to Trump by Vance's advocates within the Trump world, and that Trump kind of got, even though, of course, Vance has his whole history of saying really nasty things about Trump in the past, is that Vance is going to be loyal to Trump and to a certain vision of what MAGA and America First means. And in a few issues in particular, the border, I think, is extremely important. Non-interventionism, if we can call it that, is very important. Trump has that kind of Jacksonian mindset, no better friend, no worse enemy. He'll take out Soleimani, he'll take out Baghdadi, but for the last 8 years, he has been very wary of large-scale foreign entanglements, right? And I think that J.D. Vance has a similar worldview. And then there's a question about the working class Americans and how they ought to be treated, how government ought to deal with them. And what I think Trump saw in Vance is someone who comes from that background, came from a kind of a very disruptive early life that he writes about in his book and you can see in the movie, but that he succeeded. And so Trump wanted someone who came from the world of the working class and who also really kind of centers their stories, as they say in the faculty lounge, when he makes a vice president selection.
One of the things that I think is interesting, a twist here in the way people cover President Trump, is the fact that J.D. Vance was anti-Trump before he was pro-Trump, and the fact that a born-again MAGA person is acceptable to President Trump, in particular, enough to be his vice president. It's kind of a nuance to the loyalty test here that you might not have otherwise expected.
That's right. I mean, of course, the loyalty can always be revoked. And so this is a pretty easy way of understanding Trump, is that, if you like him, he's going to like you. If you say good things about President Trump, he's going to, okay, we'll move on. And that's how Senator Vance was able to meet with Trump in 2021 and eventually obtain his endorsement in the very hotly contested primary for the Senate seat that he eventually won. The big story here, though, Roger, is Vance's rollout has not gone very well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, this has been a tumultuous couple of weeks here, and the Wall Street Journal editorial board in particular, which of course wouldn't have been a fan of J.D. Vance in terms of being the selection and where they wanted a second Trump administration to go, has kind of been relishing this and somewhat covering it and asking the question, was it a mistake? And will President Trump look elsewhere? So give us your take on this and kind of explain to us where we're at.
Well, I think that Vance came out of the gate. There was a lot of excitement. I think on the floor, at first, not everyone at the convention actually knew who he was. But once they understood that Trump had selected him, then that was good enough for many Republicans. And I think his speech at the convention, which seems like it was, in the mists of ages past now, but it was only in a couple weeks ago. Vance's speech, it was a little bit rocky. He kind of allowed the crowd to determine his delivery. And so it was a little bit back and forth, and it wasn't what we were going to see the next day when my idol Hulk Hogan addressed the Republican convention in one of the great political communications of all time, right?
Well, so clearly you're not a millennial with the Hulk Hogan admiration.
Right. Bro. So I'm just, it's hard. I mean, look, I don't want to set up an impossible benchmark here for Senator Vance, but nonetheless, the speech was not, it wasn't
about?
gripping.
Ripping a button-down shirt is really not that difficult. Now, you could have gone toe-to-toe with the Hulk.
So that was the convention, but I thought they emerged from a very successful Republican convention. I mean, I wrote that it was probably the most successful RNC, at least in 20 years, maybe
without
longer. Yeah, and so that was great. And then Vance ran smack into this Oppo hit that had been waiting out for a while.
Let's talk about the cats.
His comments about how the Democratic Party is basically run by childless women. And then there's several other comments about him talking about the problems associated in his mind with childlessness and women who don't have kids. And I wrote about these comments at the time that he made them in 2021, and I was not very happy with them at the time, and didn't really help my relationship with J.D. Vance, but I now kind of can point to what's happening and say, hey, I mean, when you make these comments, they're going to come back to haunt you. I do think a couple things. One is it's hurt Vance. There's no question about it. Two, it's important to note that the Oppo is coming from the years before he was a senator. And since becoming a senator, he has not made comments quite as pointed, let us say.
Fair enough, but following this particular controversy, he hasn't walked away from it entirely as well.
And
right?
that is point number 3. That makes it a little bit messier, which is you would expect him to respond in the way that Trump responded when Laura Ingraham asked him about Vance's comments the other day. And Trump was just like, look, he loves families, he loves families. But look, if you don't have a family, that's okay too, right? This classic Trump is everybody's happy, everybody's good, right? Vance, in some ways, has doubled down in some of these interviews. And it's a unique response because it means that the story will be propagated for another news cycle, and typically in these situations you want to break the news cycle, you want to start a news cycle,
especially when you're dealing with a population that will be the difference between winning and losing, or very well could be the difference between winning and
suburban
and
women,
suburban
for sure.
women, the majority of our population. So let me go one more on JD Vance at the convention, get your take on kind of substance of something he raised, and then we'll move on. I got hit on Project 2025 and the Trump campaign and Harris. One of the things that came out in the speech, which I was listening for, admittedly, this is J.D. Vance's speech, but I didn't see getting a lot of coverage, but I expect and I know that you would have had a sensitive ear to it, is his emphasis on nationalism and this movement, the NatCon movement. Top of mind for me is when he was emphasizing people don't die for an idea, right? You don't give your sacrifice for an idea, you sacrifice for your home and your homeland, right? And this thread of nationalism that is highly reflective of the political community that J.D. Vance comes from and associates with in his time as Senate and running as a senator in the Senate, which is the so-called NatCon movement. Did that surprise you? How much of a place do you think it has kind of in what he'll do in a Trump administration, or am I over listening for that thread?
Well, the thread was certainly there. Vance is the most prominent elected official who is part of this national conservatism movement. He's been speaking at the national conservatism conferences for many years now. He just spoke a couple weeks before becoming the nominee at a national conservatism conference. I thought the long digression in the speech about nationalism and kind of the end about the cemetery in Kentucky, where I've heard him talk about before. Again, to me, that's not quite what you expect to hear in a vice presidential speech at a nominating convention. The point of a vice president, it seems to me, in a campaign setting, is to be the attack dog and to really kind of lay out what's wrong with the other ticket. And so talking about one's personal philosophy is a way to introduce yourself, I think, to voters for sure. But it was also, there's some opportunity costs there, and it is true that he had some good lines about how, Biden had been in politics for longer than he had been alive. And Biden had been supportive of all these decisions that are very unpopular in retrospect, whether it's trade or foreign intervention in Iraq. So I thought that was kind of obscured by these kind of intellectual arguments, right, that you find more online than you do in actual American politics in the everyday concrete reality, where people care about inflation, they care about the border, and they care about the chaos in the world. That's what the campaign ought to stress.
I clearly a missed opportunity, but also kind of instructive, at least to me, of how his story, and he's worked to integrate his personal story with a political ideology and a view of what America is and is not, and what Americans, need to defend and care about, and what they shouldn't. And this tied into this brand of nationalism and view of the homeland. We're with Matt Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute, author of The Right and thinker on all things of American politics, a go-to here for Reaganism. Matt, in the days since the convention, actually it was leading up to it as well, you've seen the Trump campaign, including President Trump himself, really distance himself from the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which our listeners and viewers no doubt are aware of, which is the Heritage Project following what they did in 1979, 1980 at the Heritage Foundation with the Mandate for Leadership, a 900-page plus book outlining policies for a future administration. They say for administration of any color, but of course everybody knew it was a plan of attack for a Trump administration. And now it's been a total break to the point where the person who was employed to do this for Heritage Foundation is no longer there.
Yeah.
Are you surprised by the coverage of this issue, that the Trump campaign pushed so hard against it, in some ways giving it more light than it otherwise needed to have, because it was something that the Biden campaign, now I guess the Harris campaign, were focusing on, but the Trump folks didn't need to necessarily indulge in it, but they seem to. Give me your take on it.
Well, I can't say I'm totally surprised for a couple reasons. The first reason is Trump does not like advance planning. It's not really his thing. Yeah. And if you know Donald Trump, if you've studied him, and I've spent the past 9 years spending way too much time thinking about Donald Trump and learning about him, but one thing that comes clear is he likes to improvise. He doesn't like set schedules. He doesn't like thinking too far in advance. He wants to leave as much room as possible to maneuver and to change and to negotiate, right? So I had always been of the view that people who are trying to pre-staff a Trump administration, which was a major component of Project 2025, or write a Trump administration policy, which was the other big component of Project 2025, were going to be in for a disappointment, because eventually they would have to go before Donald Trump. And he would be like, well, what is this? This is not me. Which is, that leads to my second point, which is, for a long time I've noticed a gap between Donald Trump and so-called Trumpism. And that gap has widened in the last year, where Donald Trump has basically said he will not do anything on the abortion issue if he's president. It will just be left to the states, right?
Right.
That is not Trumpism. Trumpism includes a lot of social conservatives who do want to restrict the practice of abortion. Donald Trump has left open the idea, raised in one podcast he gave earlier this year, that maybe foreign students who graduate from American colleges should get residency permits to contribute to the American economy and to remain here and be productive. Well, that's not Trumpism, right? Which is not only against illegal immigration, it's also against legal immigration. And even in the world of foreign policy, which is of great concern to you and to me, Roger, there's Donald Trump who says, I'm going to end the war in Ukraine, right? And then there's Trumpism, which says, Zelensky's a dictator, and we need to cut off aid immediately, and Russia's actually the good guy in this war.
Matt, I think this is such an important distinction.
So you can't pretend that your ideology is Trump's ideology. You should always just look at what he says. And if you look at it's all right there. It's in the Republican platform, right? The platform goes from 66 pages of bureaucratic consensus language the last time it was composed in 2016, talking about every single issue under the sun, to the 2024 GOP platform, 16 pages, but in reality, 20 bullet points in all caps with a lot of exclamation points. You know Trump wrote those.
Yeah.
That's what he's going to do. And to think otherwise sets you up for failure. I will just say one other thing about Project 2025. The problem became, Roger, when the media started fixating on Project 2025. And there were a lot of articles in the New York Times and in the Washington Post about how the plans for the next 4 years are being cooked up in the administration. Some of these articles started appearing last year. Sure. And there were several statements coming from the Trump campaign saying, look, this is not the same thing. Nothing is decided until Trump decides it. And unfortunately, those warnings went unheeded
by the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah, we now end up in a situation.
Well,
where
I want to read
the
quote. I want to read the quote because it's so instructive. This is from, the people leading the Trump campaign, including Susie Wiles. Quote: reports of Project 2025's demise would be greatly welcomed and should serve as notice to anyone or any group trying to misrepresent their influence with President Trump and his campaign. Quote, it will not end well for you, end quote. And I think it goes to the point you just made. Until President Trump decides it, it does not represent President Trump's views. And beyond those 20 bullet points, as you said, it's kind of open season. I mean, there are general parameters. We know what he won't do, what we likely will do, but there's a lot of space there. And woe unto the person who tries to kind of speak for President Trump. And I think that really goes to the distinction you made between Trump and Trumpism. One last point on which I'd love your reaction to, and then we should take the last moments to get your take on the Harris campaign. At the same time that they have totally dismissed, that is what the quote I just read, Project 2025, and the people behind it are probably PNG, and take them at their word, they're probably not going to have a place or a significant place in a future Trump administration. There is still probably a lot of stuff in those 900 pages that we could expect to see a Trump administration carry out. I just want to get your reaction to that.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the real problem here wasn't so much what's in that telephone book-sized volume, which I have and I've read, and which, by the way, is most of it is just typical conservative priorities,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's not the problem. It was the publicity surrounding it that became the problem. With one asterisk, and that is, in Project 2025, the document, there's a lot of language about federal abortion legislation and federal pro-life initiatives. And what we know is that Trump thinks that the life issue is a burden for him in this campaign, and he wants to separate
Yes,
as
and that
much as
probably has been the
possible.
big trigger. I mean, big trigger here, and that is affecting many races, not just the presidential. And however complicated that was when the opponent was Joe Biden, it is even more difficult now that the opponent is going to be Vice President Kamala Harris, which is where I'd like to go for the remaining few minutes we have. Matt Continetti, Vice President Harris, I think has surprised everyone. Maybe modify that slightly. I'm sure there's some people who probably maybe are not surprised with this, but almost everyone, with her ability to consolidate, fundraise out of the gate. The one thing I am surprised by is that there doesn't seem to be a different approach to the campaign than what you had with Joe Biden. I realize it's the same campaign manager, but Joe Biden running and Kamala Harris running are two, even on the same platform, probably yield very different reactions. Give me your take on Kamala Harris and the state of this race based on where things stand today as we enter August.
Sure. Well, first I should say, there is a difference between the Biden and Harris campaigns, and that is the Harris campaign has Beyonce and Megan Thee Stallion. So Biden never had that. So
All right,
she
now
clearly has the advantage
You're back into
there.
millennial land.
Yeah.
Matt. You've lost your Hulk Hogan status.
It's been pretty remarkable to watch Kamala Harris's rise. Within 48 hours of Biden dropping out, this really historic event, haven't had an incumbent not seek re-election since LBJ in 1968. We've never had an incumbent drop out this late in the race, right? So within 48 hours of his decision being posted to Twitter/X, Harris had consolidated the Democratic Party behind her. That's pretty remarkable. And then what you saw was the Democratic Party had like this, it's still having, as we record this on July 31st, like a psychic release. The Democrats are so relieved not to have to go into November with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket that they are just unleashing this positive energy and enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. So you see the enthusiasm among Democrats rising. It had been in the dumps. It's now getting close to where Republicans are. You see Harris's favorable ratings spike. She was less popular than either Biden or Trump just 2 weeks ago. Now she's more popular than Biden, and where she's higher than Trump in some of these polls too. And she hasn't changed. Nothing.
She's doubled down on it, best I can tell, in terms of what she's saying.
I mean, she really hasn't done anything. And you see this huge change in her favor rating. And then you see, of course, that sense of energy, unity, new favorability translate into a competitive election, a race that looks like it's about where it was before that incredible debate on June 27th, where it's a horse race. It may even be slightly more competitive with Harris, at least at the moment as we're speaking, because the Democrats are so excited and so enthused to have a candidate who is younger than Biden and who can read a teleprompter without, obvious distress. And so that's what I'm watching. I'm watching to see how long does this exhilaration, does a sugar high, does this this just Harris hoopla last, and can it last until election day? Maybe it can.
Harris hoopla, I like that. Certainly the Democratic convention is going to be pivotal, because it's going to be that moment where people are finally going to look at her want to get to know her, have that critical eye in a fashion that, to date, you haven't had to?
Well, I'll say this. The convention will be good for her because conventions are rehearsed and controlled and
Scripted,
programmed. Yeah. And she can read her lines. And she has a certain demeanor, and her voice has a certain timbre that makes people look at her like, oh, okay. At first glance, you can see her as a leader. Harris's problem is when she doesn't have the script. And that's what happened in her 2020 campaign, where she was faced with questions and which she could not handle the heat that Tulsi Gabbard brought to her in a debate, and she ended up dropping out 2 months before Iowa. Harris didn't have her lines prepared in the early stages of the current administration, when she couldn't talk seriously about the border, or when she kind of cooked up her great word salads there. So what I'm waiting for is, when will be the first moment when Harris has to respond in an unscripted manner?
Yeah.
And if she reverts to what we know about her in the past, she'll stumble, and that will I think maybe be the end of this just incredible rollout she's been enjoying.
Last question, we'll go to our lightning round, which I'm excited to do with you because the depth of knowledge on Reagan resides with you, Matt, in this conversation. But the last question on the subject of Vice President Harris, just a little surprised as of kind of where we are in the calendar. Harris seems to be inviting the debate opportunity with President Trump. And last I've read, President Trump is not fully committed and has been hedging on whether or not that's something he wishes to pursue. Given what you've just said about her, word salads, not being great off script, we kind of know what to expect from Donald Trump in a debate. Are you surprised by that? And I guess, do you expect to have the Trump-Harris debate?
I'm a little surprised about his reluctance to debate. I understand how he might want to reconsider the date and the terms and the venue of a debate, because I do think he has a point when he says, look, I agreed to 2 debates with Joe Biden. I haven't agreed to anything with Kamala Harris yet. But that's what he should be saying. He should be saying, well, okay, we're going to negotiate, we're going to meet. Because I do think that would be the opportunity to put her in a situation where she'll be forced to answer about her past views, which are radical, on climate, on race, on healthcare, on law and order. Right. A debate would be the place where she would have to answer questions that she might not know the answer to. Just think about it, Roger. I mean, she's been now the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party for about 10 days. As we record on July 31st, she has not given a press conference, and she has not spoken on any foreign policy issue except for Israel. And in every instance of her talking about developments in Israel, she has read from a script. And as a supporter of Israel, I have not been happy with what she said.
Yeah, that's not a script. You and I
didn't write the script.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So, but what happens when she gets a question about the U.S.-Japan alliance, right? What happens when she gets a question about Venezuela and the Maduro regime? Does she know the details? Is she going to be able to answer in a compelling way? That will be the venue. Yeah. And so I think it is in the Trump campaign's interest to debate, and I think the campaign knows that, and we will have a debate. Yeah.
All right, let's go to our lightning round with Matt Continetti of American Enterprise Institute, friend of the Reagan Institute, and someone who has written about President Reagan, most recently in his book, The Right. What have you got for us? You always have a good one. What's the poll going to be, Matt?
So what do you want to hear?
Give me a quote, a book.
Do you want to hear a quote?
Give me anything. Quote. Book.
Okay, so I've been thinking a lot about President Reagan's speech to Moscow State University in 1988 lately. Mainly it's because I've discussed that speech with Senator J.D. Vance, and I pointed to he was not a senator at the time, but I said there's no better definition of freedom than the one that Reagan offers in that address to the students behind the Iron Curtain in 1988. So I would recommend everyone read that speech, and then just across my desk is the new book called Behind Closed Doors by Ken Kachigian, one of Ronald Reagan's speechwriters. And it's just a great read. I'm about a quarter of the way through it. Ken worked for both Presidents Nixon and Reagan, and he talks about their relationship, which I find utterly fascinating. But he also has a lot of great behind-the-scenes details about working with Reagan, and so it's just hot off the presses. Behind Closed Doors by Ken Kachigian. I recommend that as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for those recommendations. Matt Continetti, great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.